start now. I know people are still coming in, but I've got lots to say, which I'll say as briefly as I can. So I'll start, and just please feel free to eat and take food and all the rest of it, and find your places while I'm talking. First of all, welcome everyone, and I'm particularly delighted that today we've got faculty members from various institutions around town, I think from the Charleston College of Law, the Citadel, and also College of Charleston is coming. So I'm really pleased about that. Wide Angle is all about understanding the world around us, not just the obvious bits. And in week one, we heard from Julie Flevel about the lives of certain Americans in London, England, before the Revolutionary War. And just to note, her book is called When London Was Capital of America, and we have a couple of copies left over from when she was here selling and signing the book. Last week, Jack McRae gave a fantastic talk about Charleston's special contribution to arguably America's greatest musical export, jazz music. And his talk, along with all the others, will be available on our website in due course. We're just sort of rejigging it to make it possible for you all to view these things after they've taken place. And we're having a break next week, but on Thursday the 28th of April, Jonathan Green, who you'll all know well, will speak about Gullah culture and the significance and influence of rice within that culture. Buy your tickets as soon as possible because they're already starting to get close to selling out. And so to today, I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Ron Atkinson from the University of South Carolina. I asked him to talk to us about South Sudan, but as you will see, there are at least a dozen topics he could speak to us about, because he is a wide angler in the truest sense of the word. To give you just a brief impression of him, because I want him to have as much speaking time in this hour as possible. Today, he is an associate professor in the Department of History and director of the African Studies program at the University of South Carolina, where he's been since 1984. He's one of its most widely respected faculty members, both among his colleagues and his students. But he actually started out majoring in mathematics at Michigan State University, but he saw the light quickly and took his master's in history. And during his PhD research, again in history, he actually worked, I think, pretty much full-time. I'm not sure how he fitted writing a PhD in, as a therapist in Asheville, North Carolina, and in Florida and Illinois, with autistic and language handicapped and behavior disturbed children and their families. Today, he divides his time between South Carolina, Uganda, and the UK. But on the day that Nelson Mandela was freed after 27 years of imprisonment, one of the most iconic moments in 20th century history, Ron was in the crowds on the streets of Cape Town. He's received countless awards in recognition of his own teaching excellence, his creative integration of research and teaching, and research fellowships, including a Fulbright Senior Research Fellowship from the US Department of State. But his work in the townships and homelands of South Africa inspired him to take a break from academia from 1990 to 96, where he led a pioneering project with TOPS, the Teacher Opportunity Program, training black educational leaders and managers, educational managers in post-apartheid South Africa. He's been a visiting or research fellow at the Johns Hopkins University, at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, the University of Science and Technology in Ghana, among others. Also at the University of Oxford. That's buried very deep in his such long and impressive CV. And in fact, he was at the oldest college in Oxford, University College, which was also my alma mater. And I was amazed to discover last night that in fact he got married in the chapel there. Luckily, Felix and I got married in the countryside of East Anglia, otherwise all the coincidences would have been too much to bear. Ron's main research focus is on the Acholi people of Uganda and the Northern Uganda War. Among dozens of books and publications, his key work is The Roots of Ethnicity, The Origins of the Acholi People of Uganda. And this was published in 1999 and then republished with a new and up-to-date foreword in 2010. Much of his research concerns what we might consider to be current affairs, but in fact, as he explained to me last night, everything he writes reinforces the principle that history matters. I think in hindsight I should have called this wide-angle series History Matters, because it's the theme that runs through almost every talk and indeed through the very veins of this amazing building and its archive. Speaking of the archive, there are some very interesting old books and documents about Sudan in the cabinet there by the piano, which Trisha, the archivist, has very cleverly found for us today. I could go on, but I hope that this brief introduction has given you some sense of the breadth and depth of Ron Atkinson's achievements and how really very lucky we are to have him here in Charleston with us today. Thank you, Ron, for coming to speak to us.
What's up on the screen there is a map of South Sudan identifying the 10 states into which what is soon to be the newest independent country in the world are divided into. But I'm going to back up a little bit to get to sort of some, oops. Anyway, we're there anyway, that's probably why it's not working. First of all, I would like to thank Caroline and her husband Felix for inviting me into their home last evening, and thank her and others at the Charleston Library Society for inviting me to come and meet with you today to talk about South Sudan. This is actually a very welcome break from the end of semester scramble that we are now in at the University of South Carolina. And I thank all of you for coming on this beautiful spring day to this really beautiful building that I've never been in before. So I appreciate the opportunity. Can people hear me? No, you couldn't. Sorry. Anyway, it's lovely to be here, and thank you all for coming today. On Monday, 7 February, just over a couple of months ago, the results of a referendum held a month before in South Sudan about whether to remain part of a united Sudan or secede as an independent country were announced. And to no one's surprise, the vote was almost unanimous in favor of secession. South Sudan will become an independent country on 9 July 2011. What I want to do today is provide some quick basics, a brief history, and look then at some of the many challenges facing this soon-to-be newest independent country in the world. So first, some quick basics. Let's go back again. South Sudan's population is estimated to be about 10 or 11 million people. And this is indeed, and that's about 1/3 the population of Sudan, and this is indeed an estimate. There is a need and demands for a new census, and this is one of the many challenges facing a new independent South Sudan government, is mounting and conducting such an exercise will be not only expensive and incredibly difficult given the poor infrastructure and vast territory, but will be fraught with political complications as well. But that's in the near future, or it could be. So about 10, 11 million people, not a very large population, but a large landmass. But the population is very divided, ethnically and otherwise. The two largest ethno-linguistic groups are the Dinka, numbering about 2 million, about 1/4 of South Sudan's population, and the Nuer, about half the size of the Dinka at about 1 million. Both of these groups are historically both politically decentralized and predominantly pastoral peoples, or at least mixed farming with a real emphasis on herding. And currently, in the recent past, they've been highly divided politically, both the Dinka and the Nuer, and certainly among or between the two. Despite such divisions, however, both, especially the Dinka, play numerically and politically dominant roles in the South Sudan government and politics. There are in addition, literally scores of smaller groups in South Sudan as well. Some also predominantly pastoral, many others predominantly agriculturalists. Some historically organized as the Dinka and Nuer in politically decentralized ways. Others are organized as kingdoms. And collectively, many of these ethno-linguistic groups straddle not only the border between North and South Sudan, but borders with South Sudan's neighboring countries. Those are Uganda, Ethiopia, Kenya, the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, and Central African Republic, CAR. So many of South Sudan's multiple ethnic groups not only straddle that north-south divide, but also are on both sides of those international borders all around South Sudan. This adds a complicating another variable to an already incredibly complex ethno-linguistic mix in South Sudan. This incredibly diverse population is located across an equally diverse landscape. In size, it's about 230,000 square miles, which is approximately the size or just slightly smaller than both Afghanistan and Texas. The terrain ranges from near desert to tropical rainforest. Though most of Sudan's landscape is grassland, savanna, relatively dry and sparse savanna. But South Sudan also includes, along the Nile, vast stretches of the Nile flowing up from Uganda, permanent swamps and seasonal floodplains called the Sud. During the rainy seasons, the Sud becomes the world's largest wetland. The rainy season in South Sudan is not only creates the Sud, the great Sud around the Nile, but makes travel through much of the country difficult to nearly impossible, especially given the paucity and conditions of South Sudan's roads. When I traveled early last year by bus from northern Uganda to Juba, currently the capital of South Sudan, and it took 5 hours from the Ugandan border to reach Juba, a distance of about 75 miles. And that was in the dry season on the main road artery between Uganda and South Sudan. South Sudan is divided into the 10 states that you can see on the map. Juba, the current capital, and there's discussions about moving it because it's not centrally located, is in the very south and western, in central Equatoria, right toward the southern part of the map, the bottom of the map as you look at it. South Sudan is one of the poorest and most inaccessible parts of the world, with the limited evidence available suggesting or indicating that 90% of the population lives on less than $1 a day. Okay, a brief history. Not only is it one of the most inaccessible and poorest parts of the world, but over the past half century, South Sudan has been one of the most troubled parts of the world, as it was racked by civil wars for all but 11 years between 1955 and 2005. The basic contours of conflict pitted a series of northern central governments, northern Sudan central governments, that were Muslim and Arabic speaking, and for the last 2 decades, governments pursuing a fundamentalist Islam against a mostly non-Muslim and non-Arabic speaking South. That's the basic cleavage, that's the basic conflict. But while this describes an overall picture with some degree of accuracy, the actual dynamics of civil war in Sudan were so much more complex than this, that this generalization conceals almost as much as it reveals. But if we here in the US tend to know anything about Sudan and its wars, it's always represented as a Muslim North against it's often expressed as a Christian South, although it's not necessarily. Many South Sudanese are nominally Christian or not Christian at all. But that's what we tend to know. But the actual wars were much, much more complicated than this. But these wars over all those years between 1955 and 2005 led to more than 2 million deaths and more than 4 million displaced people. Again, out of a population of 10 or 11 million. So phenomenally vicious and destructive conflicts. I want to put a few sources up just really quickly, just so you see them. Okay, sorry, I didn't go on to that slide. Basic contours, a series of Muslim and Arabic-speaking central governments in the north versus a mostly non-Muslim and non-Arabic-speaking south. But the actual, the way these wars were fought was much more complex than that. Okay, some sources. And because I'm going through history, the first source, and I'll just hold this up, is a really, really first-rate history of South Sudan called The Root Causes of Sudan's Civil Wars by Douglas Johnson, who lives in Oxford and has been a long-time editor of a series of books on African studies. I'll also refer to reviews in this presentation, a report that just came out this month by the International Crisis Group called Politics and Transition in the New South Sudan. Again, just out this month and available online. And then a third report that I'll use toward the very end of my presentation from the Carter Center that isn't out yet, by a friend named Marika Shumrus, called Facets of Decision Day, Southern and Northern Voices on the Referendum Process. This was really a series of interviews that this Carter Center team did during the referendum process in January of this year. All right, let me read a quote. Oh, and then being passed around is, I was going to put some visual images up in these slides and didn't get to it, basically. But there's a really remarkable photographic book on Sudan that is being held up now. And that exhibition came to South Carolina, University of South Carolina, about 3 or 4 years ago. And if you want to just take a look as I'm talking at some of these images, they're really wonderful images. Douglas Johnson argues persuasively in The Root Causes of Sudan's Civil Wars that, quote, to understand the current situation in the Sudan, one must first understand the role of successive Sudanese states in producing regional underdevelopment and racial and cultural antagonism. Let's see what the heck is put up. He goes on to convincingly describe the basic ways in which that underdevelopment and those antagonisms have operated across time, as far back as very early pre-colonial states, then heightening during the 19th century, 18th and 19th century pre-colonial states, and then heightening even further during the colonial and post-colonial periods of the 20th and now 21st centuries. But the dominant state, he shows, throughout this long period, have almost always defined the relationship between their center and the outlying regions in this way. Quote, from the hinterlands came the manpower, wealth, and surpluses on which the state and those at the center built and sustained their power. So the center has, for centuries really, a center based on the Nile around Khartoum, has exploited its peripheries. And this is not true just exploiting the periphery of South Sudan. It's also occurred in North Sudan. It's a common and long-term pattern. As we shall see in a moment, in describing details about how successive states have structured relationships of inequality and exploitation with their peripheries, Johnson doesn't stint in his criticism of British colonial policies. But he also shows that, quote, the origins of Sudan's recent post-colonial problems predate the unequal legacy of the colonial system in the 20th century. Indeed, he continues, quote, the exploitive nature of the central state toward its rich but uncontrolled hinterland, the coercive power of the army in economic as well as political matters, the prerogative of the leader in redistributing revenues to the peripheries, the ambiguous status of persons who are not fully part of the central heritage. All these have characterized the Sudan state going back before the 18th century. But British colonial rule from 1899 to 1956 Thanks. The British colonial rule from 1899 to 1956, which was formally in collaboration with Egypt, though the latter was a massively junior partner, certainly exacerbated the problems that the British inherited. It did so, first of all, by essentially administering Sudan as virtually separate North and South countries. It was part of Sudan, but they were really administered separately, with largely different personnel, different policies, even different legal systems. In southern Sudan, the basic principle was that local administration of colonial peoples should be conducted through local structures, different local structures of authority, employing indigenous law or custom, quote, as far as this was consistent with British ideas of good government and justice. It followed that given the variety, the incredible variety of indigenous power structures based on different types of customary law, there was no uniformity of law or other elements of administration in South Sudan, nor was this even desired. Added to this, Johnson continues, the Sudan colonial authorities, quote, applied a closed district ordinance to most districts in the southern provinces from the mid-1920s, regulating the movement of non-native persons into the South. In other words, the South was basically cut off from outsiders without permission, which was had remarkable effects. Thus, the administration of the North and South, already based on different foundations, controlled by different authorities, different personnel, continued to diverge over the entire colonial period. With respect to education in colonial Sudan in the South, before World War I, British based its policy on the notion that the government needed only, quote, a few educated blacks to fill the minor clerical posts in what was called the native administration. Even during the 1920s and 30s, the British tended to discourage rather than encourage education in many parts of the Sudan, of South Sudan, especially among pastoral peoples. And remember, the two largest ethno-linguistic groups, the Dinka and Nuer, were predominantly pastoral peoples. In the more sedentary and more agricultural peoples, especially in the more southerly parts of southern Sudan, mission schools and education received more, though limited importance, beginning in the 1920s. There was an effort especially to educate the sons of the chiefs so that they could play roles in the colonial system. And the literate product of these mission schools, again mostly from southernmost Sudan, provided recruits for the lower ranks of the civil service, police, and army. These men, and they were virtually all men, served not only in their home districts, but throughout southern Sudan. Education only became more of a priority and was only expanded after World War II, when the British suddenly decided in 1946, with precious little preparation or time for preparation, to grant independence to Sudan as a single entity only 10 years later in 1956. So education only began to become a priority just 10 years before independence. These unequal educational opportunities and subsequent unequal representation of Western educated Africans in administrations and in other colonial roles in southern Sudan, those roles where literacy was important, resulted from British decisions and practices. So unequal educational opportunities were the result of British policies and British practices. But the disparities, Johnson writes, which were the result of these decisions, were explained in terms of inherent cultural differences or differences in mentality among southern peoples. The British in colonial southern Sudan commonly characterized the Nilotic Dinka and Nuer as conservative and backward, while not providing them the means to where they might have changed that stereotype. And the peoples of more southerly South Sudan as progressive and advanced. This was the result of British policy. But the stereotypes were applied to entire peoples, entire ethnic groups. And these stereotypes linger today. The first North-South Civil War began as essentially one between a relatively advantaged North and a disadvantaged South. And it actually broke out a few months before Sudan's gaining political independence. So it actually broke out in late 1955, even before Sudan became independent. It was led in the beginning by a small and fractious educated political elite in the South who correctly feared that continued exploitation, marginalization, and unequal development of the South and of themselves would continue. Personal and ethnic divides among the Southern rebels virtually guaranteed defeat. But this defeat would only come after 15 years of sporadic fighting. I was in northern Uganda during part of this first Sudan Civil War, in northern Uganda, just south of the border. And I coached basketball at a school there called Laivi College, one of the best schools in the north, a boarding school. That's now been decimated by a long war in northern Uganda. But when I was there, it was a really good school. And I've been driving by doing research and noticed this basketball court. And these guys playing basketball if I went by at the right time of day. And so I stopped one day and walked up to the court, and these guys never flew up to basketball. So I asked if they wanted to coach, and I asked the sports master if he wanted to coach, and they all said yes. So I began coaching the Laivi College basketball team. A great experience. They were national champions the second year. But one of the players that first year was actually a South Sudanese who had come to northern Uganda to go to school because the situation was so bad, the opportunities for schooling were so limited in South Sudan. A really quiet young man. But I learned after he graduated that what he would do over school holidays in northern Uganda is go back across the border and become a rebel against the northern Sudanese government. This teenage young boy who I knew was a basketball player and a secondary school student. And after Idi Amin's coup, when I was there, something happened that kind of encapsulates what young men like this can have to face. There were a lot of northern Ugandans, a lot of Acholi, where I was, who were disadvantaged, and even Acholi soldiers in the army had begun to be killed by Amin's men shortly after the coup. A lorry full of young men decided that they would try and escape up to Khartoum to somehow join the former president to resist Amin. And as they were making this long and difficult journey, they stumbled across this rebel group that my high school basketball player was a part of. And he and the others in the group had a dilemma to deal with. Would they allow these young men to continue on interact certainly with northern Sudanese government and troops, therefore may be threatening their positions, risking their lives, or would they turn them back, knowing that if they did, Amin soldiers would be waiting on the other side of the border and kill them? This young man, this quiet, basketball-playing, studious young man, had to participate in a decision that turned these young northern Ugandans back. And a few days after this happened, there were reports in the newspaper about civilians unfortunately being caught in the crossfire. They were killed by Amin soldiers. After a welcome but relatively brief respite from conflict between 1972 and 83, what would prove to be an even more protracted and much more vicious and violent war erupted in 1983. Again, the overarching cleavage was between a northern regime, a regime originally supported by the US, and a southern insurgency headed by the Sudan People's Liberation Army, the SPLA/Movement M. Both the SPLA/M leadership and foot soldiers were dominated by Dinka and Nuer. And they were long supported by a Soviet-leaning Ethiopia, which explains the US support for the northern regime in this period. This war would continue for more than 20 years until January 2005, when in a dramatically different international climate, the US government, now overtly hostile to Khartoum, which the US had branded a state supporter of international terrorism, the US played a key role in promoting a comprehensive peace agreement, the CPA as it's called, that ended overt hostilities between North and South in January 2005. While there's no time to even begin exploring the details of this long and nasty civil war, Johnson entitles his chapter dealing with these long years of conflict actually multiple civil wars. And again, that captures what was going on much more accurately than a notion of a simple north-south divide and struggle. These wars were fought devastatingly for the civilian populations, not only between North and South, but especially after 1991, also within the North and within the South. And it was also during the 1990s, as these wars were escalating in their destructiveness, it was also during the 1990s that major oil production took off in Sudan. With the fields, the oil fields, in either a cruel or fortunate twist of fate, centered on either side of a disputed North-South Sudan boundary, while the 75% of the oil is estimated to be located in the South. When the CPA ending the Civil War was signed on 9 January 2005, its many provisions included the creation of a semi-autonomous government of South Sudan. It was still part of the Sudan, but the South became semi-autonomous, and a government to represent that was created. Its first president, who under the CPA was also the first vice president of Sudan, the Republic of Sudan, was someone named Dr. John Garang, a charismatic but also autocratic leader who had led the SPLA/M since its founding 21 years before. So Garang became the first president of a semi-autonomous South Sudan. But in another twist of fate, Garang died only weeks after assuming office, when a Ugandan military helicopter crashed in severe weather while carrying him back to South Sudan from an unofficial visit with the president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, who had been a longtime supporter. Actually, Museveni and Garang met in university, a longtime supporter of Garang and the SPLA/M. In what was to many a surprisingly smooth, though totally unexpected transition, Garan was succeeded by his former long-term deputy in the SPLA-M, a man named Salva Kiir, who will, this coming July, become the first president of a full-fledged South Sudan state, 6 years to the day after Garan's ascension to the presidency of a semi-autonomous South Sudan. Time's flying. I took a trip to Juba in 2006, not long after the CPA, mostly to meet with these northern Uganda rebels, the Lord's Resistance Army / movement. How many of you have heard of the LRA? Okay. That's the main rebel group that was fighting against the Uganda government in another 20-year war just to the south of Sudan's border between 1986 and 2006. I went to Juba to meet with rebel delegation, a delegation of the LRA to peace talks that had just begun really in Juba, the capital of South Sudan, brokered by the semi-autonomous government. While I was there, I have some friends in the government of South Sudan, and they're the ones who invited me to meet the rebel delegation. I also learned about some of the major problems, or learned much more about some of the major problems facing the semi-autonomous government of South Sudan. Let me go through a list very quickly, and I'll go through a number of lists very quickly, and then wrap this up. But lengthy, daunting lists of challenges that this new state faces. The first challenge that my friends and others in and out of government emphasized to me is one, the challenge to work with Khartoum to monitor and implement the CPA. That was never easy. I mean, these sides had fought one against one another for more than 20 years. So working to do that. In fact, the South Sudan government, the GOS, was actually more successful at this than I think most people would have imagined, although limited success. Two, begin overseeing the reconstruction of an absolutely devastated infrastructure after all these conflicts. Infrastructure that had always been limited. Education, roads, healthcare, indeed almost everything had to be either rehabilitated or established. Again, some successes, but an overwhelmingly daunting task. Three, encourage and build human capacity in government, business, and elsewhere. Again, some real limited success. There's been real attempts on the part of the GOS to bring South Sudanese back, to provide this human capital. My friends were among them. They spent most of the years of the last civil war in Bloomington, Indiana, but they went back. And when I went to visit, he was in Parliament, she was a deputy minister, and they were living in a tent. Because that's the way Juba was in the early years of the GOS. Four, deal effectively with an international community presence, UN, NGOs, and donors that swamped the territory. An almost impenetrable maze. Again, some limited and surprising success. The next two on the list, 5 and 6, have not been so successful. 5, cope with the internal politics and divisions, often characterized in ethnic terms, within the GOS and the SPLA-M. They had managed to fight Khartoum to a standstill, but the divisions in both the GOS, the government, and the army were enormous. 6, begin building trust, peace and trust, really, among a fragmented, heavily armed population, deeply divided by years of civil war, both across and within ethnic lines. Many of these ethnic groups had not supported the SPLA during the war, or had only sort of temporarily or infrequently supported them. Many were enemies of the SPLA. And the GOS knew that there was a need to build bridges to these communities. Unfortunately, the divisions both within the SPLA-M and the GOS on the one hand, and between communities that had never really supported the GOS and the SPLA and those who did, that really hasn't happened very much. And it's one or two of the real danger points for the future of South Sudan. The final problem that they emphasized was the reason I was there, and that is how to deal with the thorny problems created by the Northern Uganda War in South Sudan, including the threats to peace and stability by the continuing presence of both Uganda Army personnel in South Sudan and LRA at the time that I was there. The presence of LRA and Ugandan troops in South Sudan has, again, been partially resolved. The Ugandan army is still there 5 years later, though in reduced numbers, allegedly illegally exploiting South Sudan's gold and other natural resources, while also pursuing a dispersed LRA that is now scattered over wide swaths of territory in Congo and Central African Republic. But the LRA also make periodic forays into South Sudan as well. I won't go into these because of time, but there are really a baker's dozen list of unresolved issues between North and South Sudan that didn't get solved during the 5 years or 6 years of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. I'll mention a couple of them quickly. While most of the oil's in the south, the pipelines and the refineries are all in the north. So that arrangement, how to deal with this, has not been resolved and will need to be, there has to be a formula. There has to be an agreement, a legal as well as political agreement. This is one of the issues highlighted by the International Crisis Group report that I mentioned earlier. There was supposed to be a referendum in January to deal with the area where the oil wells are, the Abyei region. That never occurred. That's still on hold and still to be resolved, right on the border between North and South Sudan. 20% of the border between North and South Sudan hasn't been agreed on yet. 80% has, but 20% hasn't. The birth of a new nation astride the Nile raises important questions about the allocation of Nile water. This is water that comes from Ethiopia and Uganda, through Sudan, up to Egypt. Water that's essential to those two countries. A 1959 treaty signed only by Egypt and Sudan allocates about 75% of the water to Egypt. The division of Sudan raises questions about how this water will be allocated in the future and what kind of legal arrangements will be worked out to determine that. And this includes other countries besides Sudan and Egypt, of course. There are 8 other countries that have signed this agreement that now is in flux because of a new nation coming online. And in some ways, looking to the future, issues surrounding water could eclipse those around oil. There's the question of the citizenship of Southerners who were in the North. There were hundreds of thousands of Southerners in the North fleeing civil war, looking for jobs, serving in the army, etc. What is going to happen to that, with that? What's going to happen with those people? How strict are borders going to be enforced, or is there going to be relatively free movement? Both pastoralists who move back and forth in both directions, from South Sudan to the north, from North Sudan to the south, and others. Southerners who continue to work in North Sudan, Northerners who continue to work in South Sudan. What kind of border arrangements? There are peoples on both sides of the border whose status hasn't yet been determined in the Nuba Mountains and other parts of Sudan. And the constitutions of both North and South Sudan are going to expire on 9 July 2011, when South Sudan becomes an independent state. Both need to prepare new constitutions, and that's a difficult and complicated undertaking. There are thousands of university students from the South in northern universities, more than 20,000. Will they continue to have those places? It's unclear. That's just issues, challenges between North and South. Also, an equally long list, if not longer, of challenges and issues within South Sudan. And I want to end this litany of challenges by looking at some of those, drawing on the report, the Carter Center report that isn't out yet, that Mareike heads, this section, or begins, the heading begins with old problems. Old problems from the Schumer's Carter Center report. And this is a relatively long list, but I can deal with it quickly. These are problems or challenges that affect people's daily lives in the South. They're of primary importance, more than legal issues for ordinary people between North and South, even elite political issues and struggles in the SPLA-M and the GOS. These are things that touch people's lives. One, reconciliation. There is such division, there were such horrible things that occurred between and within communities, between soldiers and non-combatants, between different armed groups. Reconciliation is going to be a major issue, is a major issue for people. Disarmament. Almost every male, every household in South Sudan has a gun, usually an AK-47. Service delivery. This is what people most need. Poor people living often in remote, isolated areas. Basic service delivery. It's going to present a huge challenge for the new government. Many of the issues needing reconciliation concern real crimes committed by various fighting forces or individuals against others. The International Criminal Court has indicted the president of Sudan and some of his officials because of a conflict in North Sudan, in Darfur. 2 or 3 people have been indicted, I think, in that conflict. The LRA leadership are 3 other indictments in the International Criminal Court. Those people have fought in context and in wars and in a region. 6 indictments, thousands of people could be indicted for crimes against humanity in these contexts. How can people deal with those who have done horrible things to them? Literacy. Literacy is a major issue for ordinary people. A majority of South Sudanese are not literate. The Dinka-Nuer division. There has been, over the course of the war, major splits between Dinka and Nuer elites, military leaders. The elite have often papered these over, but for people on the ground, again, who've suffered because they were Nuer attacked by Dinka, and they were attacked not because they were military, but because they were Dinka, or because they were Nuer attacked by Dinka, Dinka attacked by Nuer. That division is a crucial one for South Sudan to deal with. Cattle raiding, another unresolved issue and another major problem for people who are pastoralists. And there are many in South Sudan who are. Then corruption. Corruption, when I went back to Juba last year, early last year, one of the things that was most striking, people were looking forward to the referendum, looking forward to secession, were happy, of course, that war had ended. But people were so, ordinary people, priests, students, ordinary people were so frustrated and disappointed with the level of corruption in the GOS, the government of South Sudan, and the SPLA-M. And people were also incredibly frustrated with the behavior of the Dinka-dominated SPLA, the army, which continues to be a huge army. And Dinka are posted all through South Sudan. And in areas outside their home territory, these Dinka soldiers often act arrogantly and in ways that inflame local populations against them. Some people said to me from Western Equatoria that they felt that the SPLA, Dinka SPLA who were in their area, was just another invading and unwelcome army. These are major, major problems to be overcome that are highlighted in Marike's report. Okay, let me begin wrapping up. Yeah, this is a long list of challenges. None of them surprising, given the long years of war from which South Sudan has more recently emerged, and all the lingering divisions and other problems, many that have historical roots going even deeper than these wars. But other countries in Africa and elsewhere have struggled with varying degrees of success to rise from the ashes of war. It will be a daunting task for the government and people of South Sudan to do so. But human, including African, resilience and creativity and energy can achieve important and sometimes surprising results. And I want to end with just a short reading from a journalist named Carl Meyer, who said this about his experiences in Africa. He's often asked, he says, by Westerners, why he spends his time in Africa? Why do you do that with all the wars, et cetera, et cetera? His response includes this: I freely admit to having succumbed to an overwhelming sense of admiration for the courage and sheer determination with which so many Africans seek to overcome their difficulties. In general, Africans are among the most hospitable and direct people I have met anywhere. It is true, he writes, that I've had my brushes with trouble. I've been shot at, etc., etc. But it is also true, he continues, that never have I been more welcomed into people's homes or treated with more respect. Africa is a place of constant surprise and seemingly limitless energy. Every day, he concludes this passage, every day that I'm out of Africa, I miss it. And I think I can say the same thing. Thank you for your attention. Yeah, I mentioned there are a lot of agricultural peoples, especially in the more southerly parts that get better rainfall, but also in and around this Sud. There is or could be a strong agricultural base. We don't know what it could be yet because it was so disrupted by all these years of war, and it hasn't yet been reestablished. But it could be.
What was the long-range plan for UN 25?
Yeah, international help is a double-edged sword. Always. And some South Sudanese, as they're approaching independence, would welcome a continuation of such a strong outside presence, donor, NGO, UN presence. Others are rightfully skeptical. So I'm not sure what the future is. But there's certainly a vast reservoir of international goodwill to help this be a success. And that includes the U.S. One of the most important foreign policy, it seems to me, successes of the Bush administration was really getting the CPA signed in Sudan. Let me go here and then here. Yes, yes.
How much of the oil, how significant are the oil deposits in South Sudan, and to what degree is that sharpening?
Sorry,
To what degree does the oil in the South Sudan sharpen international enthusiasm for an independent country?
I think, without having clear measurements of that, I think it's quite a bit. Just as the international community has been interested in exploiting and developing this oil, even during conflict, because it really only began to come online during this last civil war. So certainly that's a double-edged sword. But clearly it brings more international attention and at least concern for stability, which isn't always the same thing as what really helps people on the ground. But that's definitely there.
Are we setting this country up? I mean, the list of obstacles is not just daunting, it's very, very daunting. Do you think that this is the model of oil? We're not there where we could try to work for stability by sticking to a unified country, or this is drives the oil away?
The CPA and much of the international involvement ending the war and since, in the beginning, really emphasized the desirability of retaining a unified Sudan. But that relatively quickly became apparent if people talked to South Sudanese that wasn't likely. So again, the initial impetus was to maintain a unified Sudan. But the South Sudanese, again, the vote was 99% for secession, which is a little suspicious, but it probably was close to that. It probably was close to that. Let me go here and then here. Yes, sir.
I think I've read that the Chinese have taken a big interest in South Sudan. If that is so, is that a positive thing, a negative thing? How does it seem to be shaping up?
Again, like all international involvement, it's a double-edged sword, I think. But China is the only country that's involved in the oil production. There are Canadian firms, or at least maybe the Canadian firms have sold out, but there are others as well. What the oil situation does, among other things, something that's complicated but positive. Both the North and the South benefit from this oil, even if most of the oil is in the South, until a new pipeline could be constructed so that the oil could go south rather than north. These two have great incentive to at least cooperate at that level, and that's a positive. The outsiders involved, whether it's China or others, rarely have the interests of those where they're involved as a high priority, except stability. And I think that's true of China. I think that's generally true.
You got the Chinese are throwing a lot of money at that.
They are, but they're not the only ones. I mean, there's been a lot of involvement from a number of donors, and the UN presence in South Sudan is incredible to see. So, yeah, it is a very long, daunting list of issues. Yes, sir.
How does the secession, or the formalized secession of South Sudan affect the Darfur conflict?
I think the most direct way it will is that there are some Darfurian rebels that base themselves or retreat into the northern part of northern Bahr Ghazal in South Sudan, into that state. So that creates will create once South Sudan is independent some problems. Otherwise, the Darfur situation is linked to what was going on between North and South for various reasons and in various ways, but it's not directly, or won't be, I think, directly linked except in that way. Yes?
When you talk about service deliveries being a major challenge, are you talking about like basic infrastructure?
Almost everything is what I was referring to. As I suggested, that the Goss faced as a semi-autonomous game, the destruction of these wars, especially those last civil wars, is just almost unimaginable. From schools and universities being taken over in towns that the North tried to hold in the South, being taken over by the Sudanese military and totally trashed in terms of the institutions that they once were. There are tanks and armored vehicles littering the grounds of schools and universities and other institutions today from this war. So there's just a really massive building from a very, very low base. Education, health, roads. The main road from Uganda to Juba, the main road connecting those two countries, I don't remember seeing more than a half dozen roads branching off from that main road in the 75 miles between the border and Juba. So the Chinese are enormous.
Can I ask you what the population is in terms of Richard was asking about agriculture? To what extent can the agricultural resources support the population?
I think that it's definitely possible. In part because the pastoralists, most of the pastoralists also practice some agriculture, and some of those pastoralists have access to that soup, which is very rich agricultural land.
I'm sure we've got lots more questions.
Yeah.
Maybe Ron will have a couple of seconds afterwards if you want to come up. But thank you very much for giving us such a clear overview and also so much fascinating.
I'm sorry for talking